Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people around the world. This is Martin Hubel, your host of the DB2Night show. Today is a ZOS show, number 105. Where did the time go? And my special guest today is Julian Stuhler, who's a principal consultant of Triton. He's also an information champion. He's also a IBM Gold consultant. And he's not only that, he's a really nice guy. How are you doing today, Julian?
I'm very good. Thanks, Martin. That's a very kind introduction.
Oh, I'm just a marvelous guy. I'm just it's all well-deserved, I will say. So let me get the housekeeping out of the way, and we can turn you loose. So as always, we've got to, I think there might be a little pop-up here. I apologize for that, but this is the thing of having to unplug my headset in order to be able to play the music, because it has to come through my PC speakers. And I'm wearing a headset. I tried not wearing a headset for a while, but I did have somebody honestly tell me that there was some cutouts. So I'm back to doing things as a proper show host should do, and I'm wearing my headset again. So with that, here's our social media page. We have Twitter, we have LinkedIn, as always. Those things really haven't changed too much. I mentioned that we now have the replays available on YouTube, so if you don't want to download something and you have a good internet connection, you can watch Jules on our replay on our YouTube channel, and we'll put up the link for that as well. In addition, as we've done for about the last 3 or 4 years, Jules has kindly agreed to give us a PDF of his slides, so you'll be able to download those as well off the replay blog. Here's our disclaimer. As always, everything's copyrighted by somebody. The trademarks belong to the respective organizations, and you'll be able to get the stuff later. So there. I used to try to read that out, and I did such a good job for so long, but life is like, I don't necessarily need to do that anymore. Okay, as always, this is our standard lineup here where we have our announcements, audience polls, and then we have the presentation, wrap up, and away we go. I do have the new presentations in for DB2 LUW, and boy, do we have a star-spangled lineup for you through April and May on the LUW side. We've got Kerry Romanoff, who's doing the latest from the lab, talking about what's happening at DB2 11.5 next. And after that, we've gone even bigger. We've got the director of DB2 development for IBM Data and AI in the IBM Canada lab, the new face of DB2, cloud native and AI ready. Mark that on your calendar. You will find that to be absolutely fantastic. Peter is a marvelous speaker. That's a must-see show. And of course, not taking anything away from Kerry, when the chief architect speaks, everybody wants to hear what she has to say. And we'll complete the year with yours truly in June. And in April, we have all about iDoug. We're going to hear from the iDoug Dallas conference team on what's happening with iDoug. And then we have Mariella Wyrock, who's an IBM distinguished engineer from the SVL. I've yet to go back to her and bug her for a topic. And we're completing our year there with Dave Belke, another IBM Gold consultant, a regular on the DB2Night show, and he'll complete our shows in June. It seems that we're getting a little more important, with a number of the face-to-face conferences being postponed or canceled. The Central Canada DB2 user group up here I'm involved with, we have normally over 200 people come to it for a 2-day event. We've had to cancel. Our venue has locked their doors, and also with the travel restrictions, it's too hard to guarantee even that we can put on a conference at the end of April. Same thing has happened with the IBM Think conference. That's gone virtual. And there's a number of other events. Common has apparently also canceled, and a number of other things along that line. So the International Informix user group has also had to postpone or delay their conference. So we look forward to seeing you more on the DB2Night show as we continually virtual. You're free to wash your hands at any time during the presentation. if you feel the need. We will not pass on any. We will also run a virus-free show here as well. No computer viruses will be sent by us. As always, DBI is the founding sponsor of the DB2Night show, so we like to put in a plug for their demo, which is available off the DBI homepage. And if you watch that, they'll send you a nice gift card, I believe, from Starbucks. So if you haven't seen it and you want to see how to make DB2LUW run faster, that's a good thing to do. Our winner from our last show was Kurt Brune of AAA Missouri. It's nice to see Kurt on the show. I've known Kurt for a long time, at least 20 years. And he's a nice guy in St. Louis, so it's nice to see him win. And thanks to our sponsors, again, DBI, and yours truly, Martin Hubel of Martin Hubel Consulting, Inc. I wonder how I came up with the name of that company. And so there we are. There's the DBI main menu. I put this up. I won't talk a lot about it because we've been showing it for a while, and but it gives you an idea of the overview of performance management on DB2LUW with DBI. And I put this up last time, and it's still a big day for dear old Charlie. He's sleeping a lot more, but he had two big events this week. One is he's turned about 15 years old. We nominally have his birthday on St. Patrick's Day. We adopted him when he was supposedly 4 years old. It turned out he was 5 years old, but his first vet visit was May 5th, 2005. So we nominally say his birthday's on St. Patrick's Day. And yesterday was his 10th day or 10th anniversary of being adopted by us. So that was a big day, and he celebrated by sleeping most of the day. He's an old guy, and we got a new picture here with his sleeping with his face in Helen's shoe. When she went out, he went to sleep on the mat and decided to put his face in her shoe. So, as with dogs, you end up with more pictures of them than you do of your children. So we continue to add to our Charlie picture show. Okay, now we're into the polling. Let me pull those up. We'll go through this in the normal way with our first question, which is, what is the latest version of DB2Z in production for you? And it's nice to see most people are on to at least DB211 new function mode, but we're getting more and more people onto DB212, and that's a wonderful thing. And we've had that open for about 30 seconds, and about 70% of our audience has voted. So with that in mind, I'll close that off and share the results. Jules, that'll give you an idea of what we have in our audience. It looks like we have one person that doesn't have DB2, but they're along for the jokes.
Fantastic. Well, let's hope we don't disappoint them.
Yeah, I'd like to tell a joke now, right? Yeah, you'd like to hear one. Or as Helen says, that was like a joke, but different. And what other what DBMSs do you have in your shop? Just as a rough idea here. And just seeing if I could have broken that out into IMS, and there's people out there still with IDMS and Model 204 of all things. There's all sorts of weird and wonderful things that we used to run. And back when I was getting into databases, System 2000 was the very important database of the Ontario government because that ran the payroll. So with that, we'll close that one off and share the results. And our audience is good, loyal customers. It's nice to see that much DB2LUW as well as DB2 for Z. And we'll hide that and share the next poll. These are really, oops, yeah, I need to hide that and pull down the next thing. This little button here. Is your organization pursuing a DevOps strategy? And seeing what people have there. And People are voting away nicely on that. Thank you very much. And
this is where I need to sit up and take notice, right, Martin?
yeah, you could do that. Seeing as these are the questions I asked you to provide, it's always good if you know what people are saying about you. All right, we'll hide that result and we'll move on and do the next question related to DevOps. And this is another interesting question along the same lines. Do you believe DBAs have a role? And collecting that. This is an interesting question to ask people. And we'll give people just another couple of minutes on that. What do you do as a DBA when your developers are off being DevOpers? I mean, 82% feel there is a role for the DBA. I kind of fall into that number, although I wasn't allowed to vote. And got a couple of people that are unsure that might know more after they watch your fine presentation. And the last,
that's the hope.
That's it. We're going to educate people here. It's going to be great. You're going to learn stuff. And you feel automation of routine stuff is a good thing. And my experience has been, particularly when you get off mainframe and you have a tremendous number of environments, then it's very common to divide things up into various instances and databases that need management. Automation is the only way you can really survive. So be interested to see how this plays out. There's enough people voted on that. We'll share that last result. And there you go. 72% think it's a good idea, and 28% are unsure. Again, maybe they'll know more after we finish this presentation today. So with that, we've completed, and I should be back to showing my screen. There should be seeing a nice picture of yourself, Jules. And now I'll make you the presenter.
All right.
You should see a message now saying that you are the man. And I'm seeing your screen. It looks marvelous.
Fantastic.
Yep. You've even got the right date and your name and everything. So take her away, Jules. I'll be in the background here monitoring our question queue. As always, we take our questions through the GoToWebinar question and answer tool. You ask the questions. I'll break in at an appropriate point and let Jules know you have a question. But in the meantime, I'll mute myself. Charlie these days sleeps more than he does anything else, so he doesn't bark at squirrels that much. But just to keep my noise down, I'll mute myself.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much, Martin. And hi, everyone. As Martin said, my name is Julian Stuhler. My pleasure to spend a little bit of time today talking to you about some of the changes that are happening around DevOps, particularly with regard to database and DB2 for ZOS in particular, and walk you through some of the things that I've been involved with the last couple of years working with customers around this DevOps strategy. So here's the structure of the next 45 minutes or so. I'll skip briefly over the introduction because Martin gave me a very kind introduction to start with. I'll spend a little bit of time just talking about what DevOps is. It's one of those terms which is used quite a lot in the industry now, but I still come across quite a few people when you talk to them in detail and ask them what they understand to be DevOps. Everyone has very different views. So there's no right or wrong answer to that, but I'm going to give you my understanding of DevOps, and certainly that will hopefully help to frame the rest of the discussion. The next question that I get from a lot of people who aren't as familiar with DevOps as some others is, why the hell should I care? What is it about DevOps which means that it's going to make any difference to me as a DB2 guy, as a developer, as a DBA? So I'll spend a few minutes just positioning that as well before we dig into the main meat of the presentation. So this is not a general presentation about DevOps itself. I'm focusing very much on the implications of DevOps as far as DBA is concerned. So DevOps for data, what are the implications for this DevOps movement in terms of the DBA role and the kind of stuff that we all spend a lot of our days doing in terms of supporting developers and supporting the engineers that are out there. I'll take the last 5 or 10 minutes to walk you through a case study of some of the work we've been doing for a particular customer around this, specifically around automating schema change deployment and some of the things it's possible to do, some of the benefits we've seen from that, some of the pitfalls and some of the lessons learned. So hopefully that's going to be of use to you. Please, as Martin said, feel free to type a question at any time, and if I don't see it, I'm sure Martin will keep me honest and will break in and let me know that there's a question there, and I'll be more than happy to answer those as we go through the presentation. Okay, so Martin gave me a very kind introduction, so I'll skip briefly over the introduction slide and I'll go straight into the definition of DevOps. And as I said, DevOps means different things to different people. This particular definition is one which I quite like. I think it speaks nicely to the overall structure of what DevOps is to many organizations and some of the benefits it can provide. So the very succinct version of this is, it's a software engineering culture and practice that aims at unifying software development and software operations. So any of us that have been in IT for a long time, and I think this is probably even more true with mainframers, we're well aware of the traditional cultural divide between development and operations, between the developers and development DBAs and the production side of the organizations. Two very different sets of people, often with very different sets of objectives. On the dev side of the fence, it's all about delivering for the business area as quickly as possible, maximizing the functionality, getting that functionality deployed as quickly as you possibly can in order to maximize the business benefit that can be derived from those new features, those new functions hitting our production systems. Now, on the ops side of the fence, it's a very different story. It's all about resilience, stability, maintaining the service, maintaining the operational capability of the organization, monitoring and making sure that the lights stay on under all circumstances. And of course, sometimes those two sets of objectives can conflict with one another. If you've got a set of people on the dev side of the organization very focused on rolling out new function as quickly as possible and driving as much change as possible into the production environment, and on the ops side, a whole organization who is really organized around not preventing change, but preventing bad change. And sometimes the developers can see that as being the same thing. This can cause a lot of conflict between these two sides of the organizations. DevOps is all about taking those traditional barriers and breaking them down, getting development to be an integral part of operations and operationals an integral part of development. So the kind of infinity symbol you see at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide here is meant to signify the fact that DevOps is all about breaking down those barriers and making these two functions integrate with one another in such a way that development becomes better at being able to deliver high-quality, robust change into production. Production gets better at feeding back information and logistical information back to the development so that real production experiences can be fed back to improve the development process. And what we have is a virtuous circle, or a virtuous figure of 8 in this case, where each side is actually actively supporting the other. And I know that sounds fantastic in theory, and we all know in practice that there are still challenges in terms of that, but DevOps is very much about trying to break down these barriers, trying to integrate the two halves and make sure that as a result, the organization is able to more effectively deliver change into production in a low risk, high frequency fashion. So to that point, DevOps strongly advocates automation and monitoring of all steps of software construction. So you'll see many people conflate DevOps and automation is indeed a very important part of the whole DevOps experience. But automation, the tooling that goes with it, is not the whole thing. That word up in the top bullet point in their culture is very important as well. And breaking down some of the traditional cultural biases and cultural ways of working is very much one of the most important parts of implementing a DevOps strategy. So really what this means as the bottom line to the business is being more responsive and more flexible. The idea is that you should be able to shorten your development cycles so that you're able to deliver function to production in a shorter period of time. So the period of time between the business deciding they need a new feature, that feature being developed, tested, deployed, and available in production should be allowed to be reduced as a result of implementing good DevOps practices. And that means you're increasing your deployment frequency. And those of us, again, who are of a traditional mainframe background, we're all used to new application releases, major new application releases, maybe 6 months, once a year, maybe sometimes once every couple of years. And indeed, our vendors, the guys in the labs, the DB2 labs in SVL, also follow similar patterns traditionally in terms of this 18-month to 2-year cycle of new releases of DB2. All of that is changing. Customers are demanding functionality to be delivered more frequently than they did, and that means we're going to have to compress these development cycles and increase the deployment frequency. So rather than having these big monolithic new releases of application software, of infrastructure that are delivered every 18 months, every 24 months, that's being squeezed down so that many organizations now are aiming for monthly or in some cases even weekly deployment cycles for their critical applications. And the last point here is more dependable releases. So the idea here is that by increasing automation, by increasing reducing the level of human error involved in the testing and deployment of these applications, we can have a much higher confidence that more of the code is getting covered, that the deployment process being used is the same one that was used during the last time this was successfully deployed, and we are increasing the confidence of the business that a deployment will be successful and won't result in any kind of impact or outage to the business. And the other side of this, of course, is that deployment frequency. Increasing the frequency also increases the business confidence. If we're deploying a new version of the application every week, and that is successful, the business is going to have a lot more confidence that the next deployment is going to be as good as the week before and the week before that. Whereas if we're deploying only once every couple of years, it's a much less frequent process. It's much that the business are going to be potentially a little bit more risk averse because it's something that they don't see happening very often. So nothing new about DevOps. It's been around as a concept for a number of years now. Since 2007 is generally accepted as the time when it first started to crystallize as a form. But many of the underlying principles have been around us much longer. You talk to any grey-haired mainframe guy or gal, and she will or he will tell you that they have been automating things for many years. DevOps puts a new spin on that, but fundamentally a lot of the principles remain the same. I think what is different is that a lot of enterprises are now starting to really embrace DevOps practices around the mainframe and around the database mainframe in particular, which is the whole reason why we're talking around DB2 DevOps today. You'll often hear DevOps talked in the same breath as Agile and cloud computing. All of these are kind of complementary concepts. You can see how the ability to very rapidly deliver new releases of software in a robust fashion could go very much hand in hand with the whole Agile development methodology as well. So what is DevOps? I like to talk about DevOps in terms of 3 aspects: people, process, and tools. And I'm very deliberately talking to them in that order because that's really the order of importance as far as my experience with DevOps is concerned. So first thing of that is people. As I've said already, there's a very significant culture change involved in implementing DevOps in an organization, moving that wall between development and operations, breaking down those traditional barriers, making sure that in all cases there is a cultural recognition of the value of the other side of that particular divide, and much more closely integrating the processes such that operations is much more finely in tune with what the developers are doing and has advance notice and trusts the level of automation and tooling that's being used for the testing and deployment. And in the reverse direction, operations can then feed back much more effectively back to the development side in terms of recurring issues and things which are compromising the production systems and have that take root inside the development organization so that the same mistakes aren't repeated with every release of the application. Need significant buy-in from both the development and the operation side of the business. I've seen a few situations where DevOps strategies have floundered because there's a massive amount of money and effort put into changing the culture on the development side, but the operations side kind of stick off to one side, waiting for it all to go wrong. And sure enough, because they're not pulled in and made part of the whole culture change, those kinds of programs do tend to have a lot of challenges. And really, it's all about a move away from traditional job roles, from developers, from DBAs, from testers, into this much more generic engineering mindset, where people are expected to understand a much wider range of roles and techniques, and really expected to apply themselves much more widely than the more siloed kind of approach that we had before. So you'll hear this term engineer used quite a lot, and it really has quite a deep cultural significance. So after people comes process, and process is very important for any DevOps. You can't automate something with tooling unless you've fully defined the process first. So very much around agile methodologies. There's the emphasis, as I said earlier on frequent small changes. So you'll hear this term MVP, minimal viable product, which is the smallest possible unit of change to deliver some value to the business out into production. And we're breaking down these monolithic releases down into much smaller chunks, but we're having to do these things much more frequently. And as a result, we need to get these processes very clearly defined up front. And one of the fundamental tenets here is that we use the same process to deploy to all environments. So if we're going to deploy a schema change into our dev environment, we should be using exactly the same process to deploy that schema change into our non-functional testing, into our pre-prod and our production environment, so that by the time we do implement in production, that same process has been worked through a number of times in a number of different environments, and we can have a very high degree of confidence in that process working. You'll hear things like fail fast, shift left. This is all about trying to move things closer to the left in terms of a Gantt chart, and move things to happen earlier in the development life cycle. Move fast and break things is a famous quote that I think Mark Zuckerberg is credited with, in terms of the kind of mindset here of very rapid prototyping, find the problems as quickly as you can, finding problems early in the process and fixing them is much cheaper and more effective than finding them later on. And of course, as I said, with the infinity symbol here, this is all about robust feedback loops and making sure that we're continuously feeding back from the operation side back into development again. And finally, tooling. And most people focus straight on the tooling when it comes to DevOps, but hopefully I've given you an insight into the fact that people and process are equally as important here. And tooling, of course, allows you to take the process and automate all or part of that process in order to make it faster, more robust, less prone to human error, and increase the amount of work that can be done in a given unit of time. So a big emphasis on tooling, but tooling on its own will not get you to an effective DevOps environment. You need to conquer the people and the process side of things as well. So one more word on the tooling. There is a vast array out there of tooling for DevOps. These things are often called Toolchains, and really it's a matter of any given environment, any given customer taking a view as to what best fits their needs. They will have a number of tools which are already a important part of their application development environment, an important part of their deployment processes, an important part of their production environment. And what they'll need to do in a DevOps environment is to probably bolt other bits of automation tooling around those, such that you have a complete tool chain that can support you from ideation, as shown on this chart in the top right-hand corner here, through to your application development, your testing, your deployment, and through to your production and monitoring. And there is a vast array of both proprietary and open source tooling available out there that will allow you to go away and do this. It's perfectly possible for you to go away and build one of these tool chains with 100% open source tooling. That's going to have some compromises. Most of the real world environments that I've seen have a mixture of open source and some proprietary tooling in there as well. The chart on the right, by the way, is courtesy of CompuWare. It's one of the charts that CompuWare uses to demonstrate its mainframe orientated toolchain. There are plenty of others out there that you can find, and plenty of open source alternatives, as I said. Okay, so speed things up a little because time is moving on. Why should I care about DevOps as a DB2 DBA? There's a whole host of reasons here. The industry is moving very specifically in this direction. All of you will no doubt be aware that IBM has fully embraced agile development and is moving and has already moved in version 12 of DB2 onwards to continuous delivery, which is very much a DevOps kind of concept. So IBM itself is moving to continuous delivery. So on DB2 for ZOS from version 12 onwards, DB2 LUW from 11.1 onwards, IBM is moving away from this big monolithic release approach and into delivering individual functions much more quickly and much more frequently, but with much smaller amounts of function delivered in each drop. So we've been through a number of function levels on DB2 for ZOS, a number of function packs on the LUW side now. This is starting to become more familiar to us, but it's still a major change to the way in which we've been used to having DB2 delivered to us over the last 30 or so years. The survey at the start showed some very interesting statistics that the Martin ran in terms of those of you who are already implementing DevOps or who are intending to do so over the next couple of years. A relatively small proportion, I think, weren't even considering that yet. But certainly what I see in the industry is that organizations are either in the process of implementing DevOps or they have specific plans to do so over the next couple of years. And I think that survey pretty much backed that up as well. In terms specifically on DB2, DBA, sysprog, sysadmin roles, there are some very important aspects here that are going to impact the way in which all of us work if they haven't already. We've got these new development paradigms and tools that are being used not only by IBM, which are forcing us to go and understand how things like continuous delivery is going to work, but also within our own organizations. So if you don't understand about continuous delivery, continuous integration, agile, sprints, and all of the new terminology that's come around over the last few years, that can make life much more difficult when it comes to actually talking to developers and understanding their challenges and their stress points in terms of getting this stuff moving. So I think it's very important that DBAs and sysprogs understand that different way of working. There's a big push as a result of this for things like self-provisioning of new DB2 environments and schemas. So developers want to be able to very rapidly stand up new test environments, run some testing, and then throw that test environment away. So the traditional approach of putting a request into the DBA, maybe into a work queue, and having that float to the top of the work queue after some days or sometimes weeks, then having the DBA go away and submit a whole bunch of jobs to create a new schema and a new environment and some new test data, that is very challenging in these more agile environments. Developers want to be able to self-serve. They want to be able to very rapidly, when they realize they need a new environment, get that environment stood up with minimal interaction and minimal wait time for anybody else. Likewise with schema change, and we'll spend a good amount of time talking about that in the second half of this presentation, but there is a need to be able to rapidly deploy new changes needs to a schema, new indexes, new columns, changes to views, all of the kind of things that go along with a new application change. They don't want to have to wait to go away and talk to a DBA to go and make those changes. They want those changes made automatically by the same kind of automation they're using to roll out their code change. QA checking. So there is a whole host of tools out there now for going away and checking the quality of application code. And DBAs kind of naturally want to go away and make sure that the environment, the quality of new DML that's being pushed through to environments is of a reasonable quality. But the days when DBAs can manually go away and site check that are just gone. There isn't enough time in the application cycle now to allow a high degree of that. So we have to rely on automation more than we used to. And there are some possibilities out there now to allow you to encode rules into static analysis tools that will allow you to go away and conduct a lot of the kind of site checking and physical database design reviews that used to be done manually can now be done automatically to take a lot of the grunt work away from the DBAs. So as you can see, a lot of kind of culture change here. But the warning that I would give to anyone who currently is looking at this and thinking it's not going to affect me, or if it does affect me, I've got the keys to the kingdom, I'm not going to allow anything through without the good old-fashioned ways being done. There is a very specific mindset here in DevOps where I compare it a lot to the way in which the internet was designed. So the internet was designed to route around any blockers. If someone pulls a plug in a router somewhere that was previously being used to route some traffic, the internet is designed in such a way that TCP/IP protocol will route around that and get the message through anyway. And DevOps is very similar to that. The culture is such that any blockers to this rate of change, to this ability to be able to ruthlessly automate and improve the frequency of delivery, they tend to route around blockers. So if you're not careful, you can find yourself being routed around and made irrelevant inside the environment. So just a word of warning to anyone who is perhaps thinking that this isn't going to impact them, or thinking that they can continue to enforce the old way of doing things. You might find yourself being pushed around and routed around and made obsolete. So be careful. Okay, so I want to move on to the DevOps for data specifically now. So we've talked about DevOps as a movement. And for the vast majority of that movement existing since 2007, the emphasis has been on code. It's been on improving the ability of engineers to code in an effective manner, and then to test that code in an effective manner, and then to integrate that code into a wider system and deploy that code out into production in a very efficient, highly repeatable, highly automated fashion. And that's still continues to be the case, and there's a lot of expertise, a lot of understanding, a lot of experience on that side of DevOps. But I've seen two major kind of shifts over the last 2 to 3 years that have really made it much more relevant to me, and I guess much more relevant to the audience that's on this DB2Night show. The first one of those is more of an enterprise focus. So many of the digital native companies such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, the companies that were born and operate their entire business digitally and around the web, operated DevOps inside the very core of their organizations very early on. Whereas more traditional organizations, banks, building societies, airlines, the traditional kind of mainframe users, traditionally didn't get so heavily involved into the DevOps culture. That started to change big time over the last 3 or 4 years. And even more so over the last couple of years, people are starting to realize that you're only as fast as your slowest member, the slowest member of your party. If you can have all of the automation you like around code deployment, but if you're still relying on an email to a DBA or raising a ticket inside a DBA work queue, and then for that work queue to reach the top, and for a DBA to manually roll out schema change, it doesn't matter how slick the rest of your code deployment is, you're still going to be sitting there waiting, spinning your wheels until the DBA can go away and make that schema change. So there's been a general recognition that we need to pull databases inside of the DevOps culture, look at how we continue to automate some of the things which are automatable on the database side as well as on the code side. And for us, that means things like self-service, test data management, reference data management, being able to automate, as I said earlier on, some of the quality assurance around DB2 objects such as DDL and DML, being able to rapidly deploy schemas to new environments so that we can give self-service capabilities to engineers and developers to go away and set up their own environments. And then highlighted in red, because that's what I'm going to spend a lot of the time talking about, because it's the most complex area here, how we can automatically deploy changes to schemas out to our existing environments in a way which is consistent with DevOps principles that will allow engineers to self-serve, but without compromising the security and the integrity of those environments, and without causing all sorts of problems in production eventually by having inappropriate change being rolled out to those environments. So that's really what we mean by DevOps for data. It's extending the DevOps principles I've talked about to specifically encompass some of these challenges around databases and data management. So I will be using this ASCD, automated schema change deployment, because automated schema change deployment is a mouthful, and ASCD is just slightly easier to say. And here are a couple of the considerations here around ASCD. I've said already, although DevOps isn't new, the industry is relatively immature in thinking around this automated schema change. It's definitely worth bearing in mind. If you go away and talk to the major ISVs and IBM themselves, they will all tell you that they have tools and techniques available for automating this, and to varying degrees that's true, but 2 years ago, none of them were really in this game at all. So if we think about DB2 for ZOS, 35-year plus heritage here, a lot of the tooling that goes around it is almost as old, but this particular sector, this particular aspect is very new. And although you can use a lot of those traditional tools in some way, shape or form, the tooling in itself is relatively immature and is still evolving quite rapidly. The approach, point 3 here, there are 2 fundamental approaches which I'm going to talk about on the next slide in terms of how you roll this stuff out. You'll probably learn quite early on that I have a strong preference for one over the other, and we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of that. But ultimately, it's worth remembering that all of the agility in the world is not going to help your organization without some form of control. And nobody wants to be in a position where you're able to deploy to production every week, but those deployments are causing operational problems because the quality of the DB2 schema changes that are being rolled out is poor, and it's causing operational problems, performance problems, capacity problems, because there is some poor database design that's going through that's not being QA'd and reviewed by the DBA. So it's essential to retain some level of control with these things as well. So here are the 2 fundamental approaches I talked about. The compare approach here is, to me, the more robust option. I think it's one which is going to be much more intuitively correct to most mainframe DBAs. And essentially what it involves is having some kind of master DDL set. That might be at the database level or the table space level or whatever. We'll talk about that later on. And running a compare operation against that master DDL and the target schema that you're looking to deploy to, generating from that set of differences an implementation script that will be enough to make the target schema look like the master, take into account naming standards and other environmental differences, and then executing that script in order to bring that target schema in line with the master. That's the basis of tools that from vendors such as IBM and BMC and Broadcom CA that have been around for a long, long time. It's a very robust way of delivering change. The alternative, which is perhaps more familiar to non-mainframe people, is known as a delta approach, whereas essentially you have a hard-coded script that's going to take your schema from version 1 to version 2. It'll probably consist of a whole bunch of alters and creates and drops and grants and anything that's needed to get you from one version of the schema to the other. You'll then have another script to get you from version 2 to version 3, another script from version 3 to version 4. Inherently, that's kind of easier and doesn't require so much tooling, but it's got a lot of disadvantages associated with it. If your target DB2 schema isn't how you expect it to be, running these upgrade scripts is just going to overlay the upgrades on top of those environmental differences. If you contrast that to the compare approach on the left, you're guaranteed that every time you run that compare, you're bringing your target schema into lockstep with the way in which you expect it. That means all of your test environments stay consistent. You're going to eliminate any possibility of crazy results from testing due to environmental issues, and you're going to make sure that you can rely on those automated tests being valid, because you can have high confidence that all of your DB2 schemas are consistent with one another because they've all gone through this compare process. You don't have that level of consistency and confidence if you're using the delta approach. So I'm going to skip over this trade-off slide because it basically talks about the same kinds of pros and cons that I talked about. Needless to say, I'm very much a fan of the compare approach, and when I work with customers about automating schema change, it's very much on the left-hand side of this chart in terms of the approach that I recommend. Quick word on compare granularity. So I did say earlier on that there's a possibility here for you to do this compare at different levels, and you've got a flexibility versus complexity trade-off here. So looking at the very simple diagram bottom left of this chart here, if we're going to have our DDL at a database level, it becomes very simple for us to do this compare operation. We have a single deck with all of our objects in our database, all of the table spaces, indexes, views, unique constraints, aux tables, everything in a single deck. It becomes very easy to version manage that. We can give it a very simple version number, and we can track that version very easily and very robustly on the route to live through our various development and test environments on the way to live. It's a relatively straightforward process. However, that will cause some problems in an agile environment. If you have a situation where you have multiple sprints, and each of those sprints may be updating a different part of the database, different tables, different indexes, and those sprints might be moving through your route to live at different rates, it can cause a big headache trying to manage that, where everything is lumped up into a single version, a single database, to have to go away and version manage through this environment in an automated fashion. So an alternative then is to maybe consider taking that single monolithic database DDL file and splitting it down into tablespace level files. When I say tablespace level, I mean a tablespace and all dependent objects. So you might have a tablespace, the table that belongs inside that tablespace, all of the indexes, all of the views, maybe an aux table and aux tablespace as well, unique constraints. All of those would be in a single DDL file, and that would allow you then to go away and give you a lot more flexibility in terms of the way that you're managing concurrent change to all of these objects. But it does mean that when you want to deploy to a given environment, we need some way of gluing together all of the tablespace level DDL that we've got in a given deployment, so that we can then go away and use that single package of DDL to go away and compare. That's what the bottom right thing here is on the diagram. You need some kind of packaging component. I've written a few of these for different customers. You can do it in an hour with a bit of Rex. To go away and basically read some kind of manifest that says, in this particular change, we're going to change these 3 table spaces, and it'll go away and grab the relevant master DDL for those table spaces, glue them together into a single file, and allow that as input to the compare process. So that's something to consider if you're going down this path. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes now just talking about a case study here for, sorry about my slides flicking around here, a case study around this automated schema change. So this is a customer that used a tool called IBM Urban Code Deploy, or UCD, for its automated deployments. They were pretty sophisticated in that use. They already had their code deployments pretty much working in a highly automated fashion, delivering new versions of their applications through the various stages on the route to live all the way into production. And that was already working well. They were aware that there was a ZOS component for Urban Code Deploy, but they'd never used it. I've shown you briefly in the diagram here how that ZOS agent works. It basically uses JMon to go away and submit ZOS batch jobs, but you can also go away and issue USS commands directly as well via that prompt. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in being able to automate various processes on ZOS. But that was not being used at the time. Meanwhile, moving over to the right of this chart, we had a central DBA team that was using traditional well-proven processes using, in this particular case, BMC Change Manager to go away and deliver DB2 schema changes. And as we know, Change Manager can go away and do the compare, it can generate JCL, but the way in which this particular customer was using them, it often required a lot of manual intervention. They were having to edit the JCL, edit the work lists that were being produced, and generally this was a highly manual process. So in terms of the problem here, we had this velocity mismatch. We had an issue here where the application teams were able to very rapidly deliver new releases of code into production in a highly robust, highly automated fashion. But if that new release required a schema change, this entire automated process would stop and wait, sometimes a week or two, while a manual process was instigated by the DBAs to go away and specify the change, do the analysis, create a work list, get the job ready for execution, and then go away and physically execute that. So the objective here was to explore some ways in which we could automate this process without an unacceptable risk in being inherent in the deployment process. We wanted to keep that DBA control so that if the engineers came up with something bad in terms of performance or maintainability from a DB2 perspective, the DBA still had the veto to be able to say, that's not a good idea, I'm going to reject that deployment. So here's the particular tool chain that was put in place. I don't have time to go through this in any great amount of detail, but you can see over in the right, we've got a standard BMC change manager compare being done with some master DDL being used as input. The big difference here is in the center here, we've got the engineer and DBA who's able to request that process via this Urban Code Deploy tool, UCD. And because it's requested via Urban Code Deploy, it means that that request can be integrated as part of a wider code deployment. So as well as a UCD process to go away and implement new versions of a code, that process could then also go away and request this schema change deployment process as part of the same tooling, the same request. The bit at the top is really all about how you get to that master DDL. In this particular example, we were using IBM Data Studio to store a data model, generating DDL out of that Data Studio. We're using an open, a proprietary tool called SonarQube, which is able to do static analysis. And we wrote some rules for SonarQube to allow it to go away and essentially do a QA check on the DDL so that it could actually evaluate whether that DDL was worthy of implementation or not. So things like site naming standards, use of particular clauses such as close no, close yes, anything that you can encode into a rule, you can put inside there. And effectively what that means is if there's bad DDL being produced, then you can stop that at it, nip that in the bud before it gets anywhere near the mainframe and the master DDL library. You're effectively going to break the build and stop that bad DDL getting anywhere near the mainframe. Okay, so key features here. The developers and the engineers have self-service and provisioning capability, so they're able to go away and provision new environments using this UCD approach. If they basically go away and run a compare against an environment that doesn't exist, the result of the compare is a full set of DDL to go away and define a new schema for that environment. So that the developers have been given self-serve capability here to be able to go away and deploy their own schemas using this automation. That deployment can be requested either via the Urban Code web interface itself, via a web interface, as I said, via a REST API call. You can automate it via Jenkins, which is an orchestration tool which a lot of developers use. There are many ways in which this can be kicked off. Because of the need to retain DBA control, we built into the process a DBA approval email. So at the time the compare gets all the way through building a work list, building execution JCL, before that execution JCL actually runs, an email is sent to the DBA that contains as an attachment the work list, the JCL, and in this case, the CDL that's generated by Change Manager to go away and allow the DBA to review that and make sure that it seems sensible. If that work list contains any drop statements, there's an impact analysis that's run which will highlight to the DBA this is a disruptive change and they may want to take a closer look at it. If there are no drops, if it's all done via alters, then there's a statement to that effect so that the DBA knows that this is going to be a non-disruptive change that doesn't have to be given any special review. In line with this, you have an option to request a full backout capability so that in the same time as these execution jobs are done to implement a change, a set of backout jobs are generated to back out that change should anything go wrong during the implementation. And that's obviously a huge time saver. If anything does go wrong during the implementation, there's a ready tested, ready generated job that the DBA has available to rapidly back out that change and take the schema and optionally the data back to the point in time prior to that change being implemented. And we implemented all this in Urban Code via templates so that multiple application teams could go use the same function and would be able to very rapidly deliver new capabilities inside that while within these templates so that everyone could very rapidly take advantage of this new functionality. So benefits were pretty much as we hoped they would be. We saw that schema changes being implemented as part of a wider application change. So an Urban Code implementation could include code change and schema change as part of the same thing. Making sure we use that master DDL library and this compare approach means that all the environments stay in lockstep. And I was amazed when we first started rolling this out, how many environmental differences were out there, even fairly well run, fairly well locked down environments. There are a number of fairly significant environmental differences which came to light as a result of this much more robust orchestration of schema change throughout the environments. Obviously, a reduction in the amount of time and effort required by DBAs and developers to roll out schema changes. So rather than the DBA having to go away and handcraft this stuff, the automation deals with all the donkey work. The DBA still has a critical role in here in reviewing and approving the change, but that takes a small fraction of the time that it takes to go away and manually handcraft these changes. And that means we're freeing up the DBA for higher value activities, things like database design, for performance monitoring, for tuning, for things which are really very, very difficult or impossible to automate. And we can take away a lot of the grunt work from the DBA role and allow this automation to take that strain and free up the DBA for much more higher value activities. Because it's a process, it's very easy to implement a tracking step that at the end of the process would just go away and write to a DB2 table to say that this environment has been upgraded to this version of the database at this time. And that is very easy then to get a view as to what environments are at what level of the schema. And if anything did go wrong, to be able to rapidly go back and see who did what to what environment when. So it's a very useful audit trail as well. Obviously, a significant reduction in the potential for human error. And the backup capability means that if you do have a problem, you're minimizing the amount of outage time until you can get that environment back to a known good state. The lessons learned here, pretty much as you might expect, we found it essential if we're giving developers the ability to go away and effectively make schema changes. We found it essential to insist they used some kind of model management tool. There were just too many problems with invalid DDL getting through the process and breaking the automation. If you generate the DDL from an automation tool, you can be fairly confident the DDL being generated is valid and syntactically correct. And any illegal things that the designer tries to do is going to be caught at source as part of the GUI of the tool, rather than going all the way through to the automation and then the automation breaking when that invalid DDL gets put into a compare operation. Make sure you get your ZOS sysprogs and IT security on side early. They were very reticent about this ZOS agent for UCD. There are some challenges around security and making sure that that's well handled. We overcame all those eventually with the use of RECF pass tickets and impersonation, but it's worthwhile getting those guys on board early and thinking about your security setup early as well. Engage your tool vendor. As I said earlier on, all of the tools vendors now will play in this environment to varying degrees, but certainly I found when engaging with BMC for this particular customer, they were able to make a couple of enhancements to the tool, which made a huge difference in terms of how easy it was to automate this stuff. Be aware that continuous delivery encourages a different mindset for schema change. So there is an emphasis on avoiding any kind of disruptive change, anything that would involve an unload, drop, recreate. Because of these things happening much more frequently now, it becomes much more difficult to get these things through. So work within the limitations of alter, and make sure that if you do a drop and recreate, your process is identifying that and highlighting it to the DBA so that you know that special measures might have to be taken. And we got a lot of pushback from developers and engineers who really didn't like the Urban Code web interface. And they found that by going away and writing a Jenkins script to invoke that UCD process, they were much happier, they were much more used to using Jenkins and felt much more comfortable in invoking the process that way rather than going into the web interface for Urban Code. So I apologize for having to go somewhat quickly through that. There was a lot of material to cover. But just to wrap things up, I know a lot of you said that DevOps is already a part of your organizations. Hopefully, you are moving in similar lines to the way in which I've described, or at least give you food for thought to do so. There's no doubt in my mind that this is one of the most significant culture changes that we as mainframe DBAs have had to deal with over the last 5 or 10 years or so. And I would strongly encourage you, even if this hasn't impacted your job role yet, to start to consider how it might. I would strongly encourage you to be on the side of the people that that are embracing this change and helping to facilitate it rather than trying to fight it. Because as I said, there is a strong culture here about working around these blockers, and I'd strongly encourage you not to be one of those, but to be one of those that facilitates this change and recognize the fact that it's going to free up your time to be able to go away and do higher value activities. So I think we have a couple of minutes left. I didn't see Martin flick me for any time for any questions that were asked during the presentation. If anyone's got any questions, now's a good time to ask them while we have a few minutes.
Yes, indeed. I have been monitoring the queue, and the only thing I had is one person said, "Great stuff," is the only comment I have to offer you. So people so far have appreciated what you've delivered, but we're happy to take a question or two. And as we do that, I will come back in here, and I will take back control.
That didn't hurt a bit.
Yeah, that was a quickie. This won't hurt, did it? And there we are. I'm back on it. And with that, I really just have the last slide, but we have our famous last polling question that we like to ask before we let folks sign off and get on with their days. We'll ask the famous, "Did you learn anything today?" question. A fairly simple question, and we normally always seem to get a positive response to the show, and people have voted quickly on that. And all right, we'll just close that off and share that result. And there we are. Oh, we got only 90% of the people today got something from the show. That's fantastic. It's always good to see that we're providing good value to our user community. Jules, I think you did a great job. And you're right, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem when it comes to this type of change, because it will happen whether or not you like it. And,
absolutely.
And the only other thing I would ask is, with all of these environments being created, is there a task where somebody has to go out and get rid of the old environments and clean those up from time to time?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the tools vendors, IBM DevOps Experience probably being the one that's thought about this most, but they're all moving that direction, do have ability to be able to specify a time to live in effect for some of these environments, so that they will automatically be cleaned up after a set number of days. Of course, it's perfectly possible to go away and implement your own kind of cleanup capability as well, but the tools vendors are starting to get their heads around this.
Yeah, they'd have to. I have certain people clean up after themselves as they go. Other people seem to leave an awful lot of artifacts behind. Artifacts.
Now you're sounding like my wife.
Indeed. Well, with that, I will thank you once again for a great presentation, Jules. Everyone, please look forward to the replay later on this afternoon. Be safe. It seems to be in a time where we need to do that just now. And we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks for the next DB2Night show with Kerry Romanoff. And with that, we'll cue the music, say our final goodbyes, and
goodbye.
We'll take it from there. Thanks again, Jules. Bye-bye, all.